He was prepared for questions, emotions, and explanations. What he wasn't prepared for was your quiet exit. When you fade out without a word, you don't create chaos, you create clarity. And in that calm vanishing, the ego loses its grip, because there's nothing left to control, argue with, or pull back in. Silence has a unique way of dismantling emotional control because it removes the one thing control depends on: reaction. Emotional control doesn't always look like manipulation. Often it exists in subtle expectations, knowing how you'll respond, how quickly you'll reply, how much reassurance you'll offer, and how willing you'll be to smooth things over when effort drops. Over time, these patterns become familiar, and familiarity gives the ego a sense of leverage. When you stop responding without explanation, that leverage disappears. There is no longer a predictable emotional outcome to his actions. He can't rely on your concern, your questions, or your attempts to reconnect. Silence interrupts the loop that once gave him a sense of influence. And because the ego measures itself through impact, the loss of that impact feels destabilizing. For a long time, your emotional availability may have acted as a safety net. Even when things were unclear or inconsistent, you showed up, you communicated, you waited, you hoped. Those responses unintentionally taught him that access to you was stable, even when his effort wasn't. Silence removes that lesson instantly. It signals that access is no longer guaranteed. This is where emotional control breaks down. Control requires reaction. It requires confirmation that one person still cares enough to react. Without that confirmation, the ego starts to question its position. Am I still important? Did I miscalculate? Is this really over? Silence offers no reassurance, and that uncertainty forces internal reflection. What makes this so powerful is that silence doesn't argue or accuse. It doesn't invite defense or denial. There is nothing to push back against. The mind fills the void on its own, often with the very truths that were avoided before. Without your voice guiding the narrative, he is left with his own thoughts, and those thoughts may not be kind. From your side, choosing silence is not about punishment. It's about self-preservation. You've already communicated. You've already expressed your needs. Continuing to engage would only keep you emotionally invested in a dynamic that has shown its limits. Silence becomes the moment you stop managing the emotional environment for both of you. There is also a shift in how you experience yourself. When you stop reacting, you regain mental space. You're no longer checking your phone, replaying conversations, or wondering how to say things differently. That space creates calm, and in that calm, you reconnect with your own sense of stability. The ego struggles with silence because it removes relevance. Even negative attention can feel validating. Silence offers none. It suggests that your emotional energy is no longer available. And when someone realizes they no longer occupy space in your emotional world, the loss is profound. This keynote isn't about disappearing to provoke regret. It's about understanding that your energy is valuable. Silence is not absence of care, it's the presence of boundaries. And when those boundaries are enforced quietly, without explanation or drama, emotional control loses its grip completely. By choosing silence, you step out of a role that required constant engagement to sustain itself. You don't need to announce your exit for it to be real. The absence of response is the response. And in that stillness, the dynamic changes forever. Silence has a unique way of dismantling emotional control because it removes the one thing control depends on: reaction. Emotional control doesn't always look like manipulation. Often it exists in subtle expectations. Knowing how you'll respond, how quickly you'll reply, how much reassurance you'll offer, and how willing you'll be to smooth things over when effort drops. Over time, these patterns become familiar, and familiarity gives the ego a sense of leverage. When you stop responding without explanation, that leverage disappears. There is no longer a predictable emotional outcome to his actions. He can't rely on your concern, your questions, or your attempts to reconnect. Silence interrupts the loop that once gave him a sense of influence. And because the ego measures itself through impact, the loss of that impact feels destabilizing. Long time, your emotional availability may have acted as a safety net. Even when things were unclear or inconsistent, you showed up. You communicated, you waited, you hoped. Those responses unintentionally taught him that access to you was stable, even when his effort wasn't. Silence removes that lesson instantly. It signals that access is no longer guaranteed. This is where emotional control breaks down. Control requires feedback. It requires confirmation that one person still cares enough to react. Without that confirmation, the ego starts to question its position. Am I still important? Did I miscalculate? Is this really over? Silence offers no reassurance, and that uncertainty forces internal reflection. What makes this so powerful is that silence doesn't argue or accuse. It doesn't invite defense or denial. There is nothing to push back against. The mind fills the void on its own, often with the very truths that were avoided before. Without your voice guiding the narrative, he is left with his own thoughts, and those thoughts may not be kind. From your side, choosing silence is not about punishment, it's about self-preservation. You've already communicated, you've already expressed your needs. Continuing to engage would only keep you emotionally invested in a dynamic that has shown its limits. Silence becomes the moment you stop managing the emotional environment for both of you. There is also a shift in how you experience yourself. When you stop reacting, you reclaim mental space. You're no longer checking your phone, replaying conversations, or wondering how to say things differently. That space creates calm. And in that calm, you reconnect with your own sense of stability. The ego struggles with silence because it removes relevance. Even negative attention can feel validating. Silence offers none. It suggests that your emotional energy is no longer available. And when someone realizes they no longer occupy space in your emotional world, the loss is profound. This keynote isn't about disappearing to provoke regret. It's about grip that your energy is valuable. Silence is not absence of care, it's the presence of boundaries. And when those boundaries are enforced quietly, without explanation or drama, emotional control loses its grip completely. By choosing silence, you step out of a role that required constant engagement to sustain itself. You don't need to announce your exit for it to be real. The absence of response is the response. And in that stillness, the dynamic changes forever. Fading out without confrontation is one of the most effective ways to end a pattern because it removes the stage the pattern depends on. Conflict keeps the connection alive, even when it feels difficult. It invites dialogue, defense, negotiation, and emotional exchange. As long as there is engagement, the dynamic has oxygen. When you fade out quietly, you take that oxygen away. Many unhealthy or unbalanced dynamics survive not because they are fulfilling, but because they are familiar. The roles are known. You bring concern, effort, and patience. He brings inconsistency, avoidance, or minimal change. Confrontation often reinforces these roles. You explain what hurts. He listens just enough to calm the moment. Things improve briefly, then return to the same place. Each conversation feels like progress, but the pattern remains intact. Fading out ends this cycle without giving it another chance to reset. There is no final discussion to dissect, no promises to weigh, no apologies to interpret. The pattern simply loses one of its contributor, and without participation, it cannot continue. For the ego, this is unsettling because confrontation allows it to remain active. It can argue its case, rationalize behavior, or even appear self-aware without actually changing. Fading out removes that opportunity. There is no platform for defense, no chance to reframe the situation in a more comfortable light. The story stops mid-sentence, and that lack of resolution creates discomfort. From your side, fading out is not about avoiding truth. It's about recognizing when truth has already been spoken and ignored. You have communicated, you have tried to repair. Continuing to confront would only deepen your emotional investment in something that has not met you halfway. Fading out is the moment you accept what the pattern has shown you and choose not to participate anymore. This kind of exit also protects your dignity. Clash can sometimes pull you into positions you don't recognize, over-explaining, pleading, or justifying your needs. When you fade out, you don't have to perform emotional labor one last time. You leave intact without having to prove why you're leaving. There is a quiet authority in this choice. You are no longer asking for change, you are making one. You stop waiting for clarity from someone else and create clarity through your actions. That decisiveness is powerful because it is internal. It does not rely on agreement or understanding. The ego often collapses not in the heat of conflict, but in the stillness that follows. Without confrontation, there is no emotional resolution to cling to. The mind loops on what went wrong, not because you accused, but because you disengaged. And disengagement suggests finality. Fading out also allows you to heal without reopening wounds. Each confrontation risks reopening hope, reigniting attachment, or pulling you back into familiar pain. Silence creates space. In that space, your nervous system calms, your perspective sharpens, and your self-trust strengthens. Ending a pattern without confrontation is not passive. It is deciding. It says, I've seen enough. And when you act from that place, you don't need the other person to understand. The pattern ends because you stop feeding it, and without fuel, it cannot survive. Absence has a way of demanding honesty where words often fail. When you are present, communicating, and emotionally available, there is always room for interpretation. Intentions can be debated, misunderstandings can be blamed, and responsibility can be softened. Words create flexibility. Absence removes it. When you are no longer there, the situation becomes stark and reflection becomes unavoidable. For a long time, your presence may have allowed him to avoid fully examining his behavior, even if he knew something was off. The continuation of the connection made it easy to postpone accountability. Your availability signaled that things were not yet serious enough to require change. Absence changes that signal entirely. It communicates consequence without confrontation. Reflection begins when there is nothing left to respond to, no messages to interpret, no tone to analyze, no conversation to steer. The mind turns inward. He may begin replaying moments he once dismissed, recognizing patterns he previously ignored, not because you pointed them out again, but because the safety of your presence is gone. The ego resists this process because reflection threatens the image it holds of itself. It prefers narratives where circumstances, timing, or misunderstandings are to blame. Absence strips away those buffers. It raises uncomfortable questions. Did I take her for granted? Did I assume she would always stay? Did I ignore what mattered because I thought there was more time? What makes absence so powerful is that it does not demand answers. It simply creates space for them to surface. Unlike arguments which can end with temporary resolution, absence lingers. It doesn't rush understanding. It allows realization to arrive at its own pace, often more deeply than anything spoken in the heat of emotion. From your side, choosing absence is an act of trust in reality. You stop trying to convince someone to see what you see. You let your withdrawal speak for itself. This doesn't mean you are hoping for regret or change. It means you are no longer willing to carry the emotional burden of making things make sense for both of you. There is also clarity that comes with stepping away. When you are no longer dunk in the dynamic, you see it more objectively. You notice what you tolerated, how often you compromised, and how little was required to keep you engaged. Absence reveals not only his patterns, but yours. And that awareness is essential for growth. The ego feels the weight of absence because it cannot negotiate with it. There is no opportunity to correct perception or minimize impact. It stands as a quiet verdict on the dynamic. Something mattered enough to walk away from. That realization can be unsettling, especially when it arrives without warning or explanation. Absence also redefines power. Power shifts from the one who reacts to the one who chooses. By stepping away, you reclaim agency over your time, energy, and emotional space. You are no longer waiting for insight or effort to arrive from the outside. You generate closure internally. In the end, reflection born from absence is deeper because it is self-directed. It doesn't come from being told what went wrong. It comes from experiencing what is missing. And that kind of understanding, whether it arrives or not, no longer determines your next step. You've already taken it. When you offer no explanation, you remove the ego's favorite tool, defense. Explanations invite response. They give someone the opportunity to justify, rationalize, or reshape the narrative in a way that protects their self-image. Even when explanations are honest and calm, they still create a doorway for the ego to step in and reassert control. By choosing not to explain, you quietly close that door. For a long time, you may have felt responsible for making yourself understood. You clarified your intentions, softened your words, and gave context for your feelings, hoping that understanding would lead to change. But understanding without action rarely transforms a dynamic. Over time, explanations become less about clarity and more about maintaining connection. They keep you emotionally engaged, even when the situation isn't evolving. When you stop explaining, the ego loses its ability to deflect. There is no argument to counter, no tone to criticize, no reasoning to twist. The absence of explanation doesn't create confusion, it creates exposure. The situation stands on its own, unfiltered by discussion or justification. This is deeply cramped for the ego because it thrives on narrative control. It wants to believe that if it had more information, more time, or a better explanation, things would be different. When you offer none, that illusion collapses. The mind is forced to confront a simpler truth. Something ended because it wasn't working. From your side, not explaining is an act of trust in your own judgment. You don't need to convince anyone that your decision is valid. You know what you experienced. You know what you needed. You don't require permission to leave a situation that no longer feels right. That internal certainty is grounding. There is also strength in allowing someone to sit with their own questions. You are not responsible for resolving their discomfort. By not explaining, you stop taking on emotional labor that was never yours to carry alone. You release yourself from the role of caretaker of their understanding. The ego often interprets explanations as openings. It looks for ways to promise change, minimize impact, or suggest alternatives. Without explanation, there is nothing to negotiate. The decision stands as it is. This finality can feel abrupt, but it is often the most honest ending. Importantly, not explaining does not mean you were unclear. It means you have reached a point where clarity has already been given. Continuing to explain would only delay your own healing. Silence becomes the boundary that protects your peace. When the ego is denied a defense, it is left with reflection instead. It may replay conversations, reconsider assumptions, and question choices, or it may resist and rationalize. Either way, that process no longer involves you. You have stepped out of the dynamic entirely. In choosing not to explain, you honor your energy. You recognize that your time and emotional capacity are finite. You stop spending them on conversations that circle without resolution. And in doing so, you create an ending that is clean, dignified and free from the need to be understood in order to move forward. Choosing peace over closure is a quiet rebellion against the belief that resolution must come from someone else. For a long time, closure may have felt like the final conversation, the explanation that makes everything make sense, or the moment where he finally understands what he lost. That belief keeps you emotionally tethered. It suggests that your ability to move on depends on his awareness, remorse, or clarity. When you choose peace instead, that tether dissolves. Closure often sounds commissioned, but it can become another form of attachment. It keeps you revisiting the past, replaying moments, and imagining different outcomes. You wait for a conversation that may never arrive, or, if it does, may not give you what you hoped for. Peace, on the other hand, does not require agreement. It doesn't need acknowledgement. It is an internal decision to stop reopening a chapter that has already taught you what you needed to learn. The ego struggles with this choice because it removes the final lever of influence. As long as you seek closure, there is still emotional access. There is still a sense that your healing is unfinished, that something remains unresolved. When you choose peace, you signal that you are no longer waiting, that your life is moving forward regardless of whether the story is neatly wrapped. This is where authority is restored. Authority is not dominance or control over another person. It is sovereignty over your own emotional world. When you stop seeking closure, you reclaim that sovereignty. You decide that your peace is more important than answers that may only reopen wounds. From your side, this choice creates stability. You stop asking why and start accepting what is. You recognize that understanding someone's behavior does not change its impact. You may never know all the reasons, but you know how it made you feel. That knowledge is enough to move forward. Choosing peace also shifts how you relate to variability. Instead of seeing unanswered questions as loose ends, you see them as confirmation. The lack of clarity becomes clarity. It tells you that this dynamic could not meet you where you were. And that realization brings calm rather than confusion. The ego feels this shift because it can no longer position itself as the gatekeeper of your healing. There is no final conversation to manage, no apology to offer or withhold. The power dynamic collapses because you are no longer seeking anything from it. Your authority comes from within. This doesn't mean you suppress emotion or avoid grief. Peace allows space for both. It simply means you are no longer looking outward for permission to feel better. You grieve what was, learn from it, and let it go without needing the other person to participate in that process. In choosing peace over closure, you also set a new standard for yourself. You learn that your well-being does not require full understanding of another person's choices. You trust yourself enough to move on without every answer. That trust is grounding, and it carries forward into future relationships. Authority is restored when you no longer outsource your emotional resolution, when you stop waiting for the perfect ending and accept a quiet one. Peace becomes the proof that you don't need closure to be whole. You needed alignment, and in choosing peace, you found it. When you disengage fully, the dynamic doesn't slowly fade. It collapses under its own weight. Many connections survive not because they are healthy, but because one person continues to participate, explain, hope, and emotionally invest. Disengagement removes that final support beam. Without effort from both sides, the structure cannot stand. Remove fully is different from pulling back temporarily. It's not a pause designed to see what happens. It's a decision to stop giving energy where it no longer belongs. There are no check-ins, no curiosity about how he's feeling, no quiet monitoring from a distance. Emotional disengagement is complete when you are no longer orienting your inner world around the dynamic at all. This is what the ego cannot handle. As long as there is partial engagement, it can assume relevance. Even minimal responses suggest possibility. Full disengagement removes that possibility entirely. There is no emotional access left to negotiate, no signal that you might return if the right words are said. The door isn't slammed, it's simply closed and locked from the inside. For the ego, this feels like erasure. It's not the loss of the relationship alone, but the loss of influence. Influence is what reassures the ego that it still matters. When you disengage fully, you are no longer affected by his attention, absence, approval, or regret. That neutrality is deeply unsettling, because it means he no longer has a role in shaping your emotional state. From your side, full disengagement is where freedom begins. You stop replaying scenarios, imagining alternate endings, or checking for signs of change. Your attention returns to your own life, your routines, your goals, your sense of self. The mental noise quiets. What once felt consuming begins to feel distant and small. This is also where clarity deepens. Without emotional investment clouding your perception, you see the dynamic for what it truly was. You recognize how much energy it required to sustain, how often you carried the weight alone, and how little space there was for your needs. That clarity reinforces your decision and makes returning unthinkable. The cave-in of the dynamic happens naturally at this stage. There is nothing left to respond to, no emotional exchange to revive. Even if he reaches out, the interaction no longer lands the same way. The attachment has loosened, the hook is gone. What once pulled you in now feels neutral or even irrelevant. Importantly, disengaging fully is not an act of harshness, it's an act of completion. You're not withdrawing to punish or provoke, you're stepping away because you've finished learning what the situation had to teach you. There is no resentment fueling the distance, just self-respect. The ego often tries to reassert itself when it senses this finality. It may attempt sudden interest, nostalgia, or reflection. But full disengagement means you don't read these signals as invitations. You see them as echoes of a dynamic that no longer exists. And because you are no longer emotionally available, they lose their impact. It is about the quiet power of finality. When you disengage fully, you don't need to prove anything. You don't need validation, apology, or acknowledgement. The collapse happens because the dynamic depended on your participation, and you are no longer participating. What remains is you, intact and grounded, no longer defined by what didn't work. And in that space, something better has room to enter. Not because you faded out to be noticed, but because you faded out to come back to yourself. Fading out without a word is not about disappearance. It's about decision. When you stop explaining, reacting, and engaging, you reclaim your energy and your authority. The ego may crumble in the quiet, but your focus is no longer there. What matters is that you chose peace over noise, self-respect over attachment, and yourself over a dynamic that could only survive on your effort.